only about men who might be interested in exploring the diaconate, the permanent diaconate, in this place right here, 6 p.m. on Tuesday the 16th. And the other thing is that on January 24th and then on the 30th, 31st, 2 consecutive Wednesdays, I guess the 24th and the 31st, Father Rainey is doing a special faith formation program here at 5 o'clock in the parish hall, looking at the title, the theme is In His Image, Understanding Church Teaching on Human Sexuality. And it's really going to be looking at any questions that people currently have about the recent Fiducia Supplicans of Pope Francis. So that's going to be done in 2 parts. And I encourage you to come and encourage others to come. I think it's going to be really an outstanding opportunity to discuss that and to maybe review actually what the church does teach about sexuality, okay? So those 2 things. About the schedule, I do want to talk about that too real quickly because it has changed, and it's actually changed a little bit since I gave you the change. The only thing constant is change, right? But just want to point out some things out to you that the reason we shifted some things around is because the bishop wanted to come and be with you on February the 4th. So we've put him in this time slot for adult faith formation for OCIA to meet together. And then we are concurrently running for about 4 weeks. We're going to be running a program called Calling Catholics Home. It's another announcement I need to make. The first of those will meet on Thursday, January the 18th, and we'll be meeting in here. I'm going to be facilitating that program for the most part with Father Rainey. It is for people who've been away from the church, who are trying to find their way back, who might have questions, who might be, if there's something that's keeping them from coming back. Maybe it's just that they wandered away intending to come back and never did. Maybe they've got something that they're upset with the church about. Maybe they've been hurt. Maybe there's some question they have about a church teaching. Anyway, we're going to be running that for 4 weeks, encouraging people to come. So if you know someone who's been away from the church, encourage them maybe to check that out, Calling Catholics Home, okay? But that's going to be running concurrently with sort of these other things that we're doing. So Bishop Malone wants to meet that morning, that Sunday, February 4th, with everybody here, plus anybody who might have been part of that program, Calling Catholics Home, to have an opportunity to meet with them as well, okay? So that's the reason the schedule changed. So on February 4th, he will be here, and then I was originally scheduled to teach on that day. I was going to do a presentation on sacred art, the good, the true, the beautiful, understanding the divine through art. So a teaching on sacred art that I've now moved to the next week, okay? So just watch your email. Maybe that's the best way to do this. I won't kill any more trees and burn any more paper by publishing things that I'm only going to change. All right. Some resources back on the back table that you can pick up. One of them is something we've handed out before. It's the Mystery of the Eucharist and the Life of the Church. This is the USCCB document that was released last year during the second year of the Eucharistic Revival. So basically the cathedral just reprinted that for people to have as a resource. And also we have some of those This Is My Body books that were left over from Bishop Barron. If you didn't get one of those, pick that up. And some information about the Eucharistic Revival and Eucharistic Congress, which will be in July in Indianapolis. Anybody in here planning to be at the Eucharistic Congress? Okay, well, there'll be 3 of us there. Okay, it's going to be a wonderful event. It's the first time it's happened in 85 years that the church has come together in the United States to really celebrate and explore the meaning of the Eucharist. So, this exhibit that we have here will be here until, actually at least until April 3rd. It's not actually complete. There are a few panels that are not represented here this morning, but that's because I'm trying to figure some things out with regard to placement and easels and things like that. So we'll get that finished by next week. It'll be complete. I know that it's a little overwhelming, but I want you to consider this. When Blessed Carlo Acutis put this exhibit together, literally he finished it on his deathbed 8 days before he died at the age of 15 from leukemia, he had chronicled and documented almost 100 Eucharistic miracles. So if we were to have acquired the entire exhibit, it wouldn't fit in the parish hall. So this is just a few of the Eucharistic miracles that he documented. I'm going to talk a little bit about his project this morning. Really remarkable young man. We will have this exhibit, as I said, until at least April 3rd, because on April 3rd, Blessed Carlo's aunt, Adriana Acutis, will be with us at the cathedral. She's coming here. She actually lives in Turin, in Italy, northern Italy. She is the vice president of the foundation, the Acutis Foundation, and they are actually covering her expenses for coming here. She will be here to talk to us on the evening of Wednesday, April 3rd, about her field. Actually, she's an expert in the Divine Mercy image. And I got to know her because I was we're collaborating on a project related to the shroud image and the Divine Mercy image, and that's how I came to know her. And she's a wonderful, wonderful lady. She's going to be with us that evening to talk about Divine Mercy and obviously probably talk a little bit about her nephew as well, who she wants everybody to know. When I told her we were doing this morning, she wants everybody to know that he was just a teenager. He was a normal teenager in every way, except that he had a great love of the Eucharist and had a great love of Jesus, and did from the age of 3. So I encourage you to check that out this morning. These are only a few of the ones he's documented. There is one of the major ones that I'm going to be talking about this morning is actually the one of Tixla, Mexico, which is not represented here, but it will be by next week. So be sure to check that out. All right, Eucharistic miracles. Anybody struck by the oddity of that term, Eucharistic miracles? Anything odd about that term? The Eucharist is itself a miracle. That's right. And I've always could have been struck by that. Every Eucharist is a miracle. You know, that ordinary elements of bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, the literal body and blood of Christ. And here's what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says about this. Because, and I don't want to read all that to you because I know you can read, but the Catechism is very, very specific in our teaching about this, that there is a change in substance, okay, and that this is something the Church has properly called transubstantiation, that by the consecration of the bread and wine there takes place a change of the whole substance of the bread into the body of our Lord, and of the whole substance of the wine into the substance of his blood. Now, we've explored this teaching in here before, I know, but I want to also point out something that St. Thomas Aquinas said that's quoted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is that in this sacrament are the true body of Christ and his true blood, but it's something that he says cannot be apprehended by the senses. Okay? Now, we've explored this in here before, haven't we? Isn't it a good thing that we don't apprehend it with our senses? Isn't that a great grace to us, that it comes to us this way? Okay? And so this struck me, as we're talking about these specific Eucharistic miracles we're going to be talking about this morning, cannot be apprehended by the senses. So if it's something that cannot be apprehended by the senses, do you understand why then we might really focus on those instances where there's something that can be apprehended by the senses? If, in fact, every Eucharist is a miracle, and if, in fact, every time we receive the Eucharist, we are receiving the physical body and blood of Christ, then why would we focus on these specific ones? Because, precisely because, it is something that is apprehended by our senses. At least early on, Eucharistic miracles, if you go back to the earliest ones that are documented in the history of the Church, and there are some from the early centuries that are not well documented, okay? Really beginning with the one in Lanciano in Italy in the 9th century is where we begin to see the Church taking more of a role in setting things properly down in writing, documenting a chain of custody of these events. Probably there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of these that have happened through the centuries that are not documented, okay? But at least early on, we get the sense that doubt seemed to be a bit of a factor in these miracles, the appearance of Eucharistic miracles. This is certainly true in the case of the one at Lanciano, for instance. Often at times of turmoil in the church, there would be periods of documented Eucharistic miracles. But the intent is always apparently to edify us in some way, to build us up, to bolster our faith, to strengthen our faith in the Eucharist. The belief that He is with us in the Eucharist just as He said He would be. So it becomes a physical manifestation, something that can be visibly, tangibly apprehended, to use the angelic doctor's term, right? To be apprehended by our senses. But because we are dealing with physical matter, a host transformed into something that is not a host, which we're going to talk about. I've got 4 Eucharistic miracles I want to talk about this morning. When you have something like that, a physical change that we know is there, but not apprehended by our senses, and suddenly it is apprehended by our senses, because the host has physically changed in a way that science can document, has changed. Many of these Eucharistic miracles have been forensically studied. And I mean intensively studied from the perspective of pathology, forensic science. This is especially true in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, where we have these great advances in science that have permitted this to happen. It's good to examine some of these, and they're really nothing short of fascinating. I mean, they really are fascinating. So, as I mentioned, Blessed Carlo, whose image is over here on this first panel, Blessed Carlo Acutis was fascinated by them as a young boy. And he saw them as helpful to the faithful and the non-faithful. He shared them with his classmates at first, young people who had fallen away from the church, didn't want to go to church, no longer believed in the Eucharist or the Mass. So he began to document them sort of in a very, for his ages, it's quite remarkable. He began to document them in a way that incorporated the science, the known science about them, but also the history. Like, what was the chain of custody of these? And by the age of 13, he began to build a website. Okay? He undertook this project of cataloging all the Eucharistic miracles. As I mentioned, there's probably close to 100, I think, that he documented before he died. And he had this was a very special young man. Can we just talk about that for just a second? Very special young man. At the age of 3, his family says, they knew there was something different about Carlo, because he began to experience visions. And he would describe these to his parents and to his family. And I think, and I'll perhaps let Adriana speak to this if she wishes to. But I don't think that necessarily, like a precocious little 3-year-old. I mean, what would you say to a 3-year-old who comes and tells you they've had a vision? Well, until one day, Carlo was in the care of a babysitter, a caretaker, and he went to the caretaker to ask that someone take him to church to pray for his grandfather, who he said had come into his room and said he had gone to be with Jesus. He was 3 years old, okay? No one knew at that point that his grandfather had in fact just died. Carlo didn't know. Nobody in the family knew the grandfather had died. So I think then they began to think maybe there's something a little different about Blessed Carlo, the special Carlo, right? So then he, as I said, he was a perfectly normal child in every way. Just like, when we think about the saints, we've talked about this before, that these are people who are not any different than we are. They just live more model lives. And it doesn't mean that they don't struggle with the normal things. Carlo was a normal teenager. But he read voraciously about the faith. As soon as he was old enough to read, he was reading about the lives of the saints. He was reading about the Eucharistic miracles that he'd heard about. And as I said, that's when he began to document them. At the age of 12, he was a licensed catechist in his diocese. The age of 12. Okay? Which is the year that most are taking confirmation classes, right? At the age of 12, he was already teaching confirmands. And he was a computer geek, as some would say. I think that's fair to describe him that way. By age 14, he had mastered several computer languages. He had designed dozens of websites, including one for his own diocese. The bishop went to him to design the website. And he began work on the Eucharistic Miracles project, as I said, in 2004. At the age of 13, he began working on that. And he finished 2 years later, literally only days before his death, from a very acute and aggressive onset of a childhood leukemia, an adolescent leukemia. Very aggressive, that claimed his life at the age of 15. So, as you know, he is in the canonization process. He was beatified this last year by Pope Francis, and so he's Blessed Carlo. But after his death on October 12th of 2006, his parents brought his body back to Milan originally, brought his body to their home in Milan for 4 days. And it was there that sort of the after-death stories about Blessed Carlo began, because many people reported that his body had an odor of sanctity, had a very sweet odor to it. And as I said, this is a wake that lasted for 4 days. It is also said that many of his classmates, I mentioned that earlier, that he really served as an example and inspiration to many of his classmates who had fallen away from the church. Many of them returned because they were so moved by his piety and his holiness. His final words that were recorded by his mother before he lapsed into a coma were, "Do not be afraid. Since Jesus became a man, death is the way towards life, and we don't need to flee it." So there are hundreds, as I said. He didn't document quite all of them, but some of them have been studied more than others. Some are quite old. One of the most renowned Eucharistic miracles is the miracle of Lanciano, which is the first panel here on the table, which dates back to the 8th century in Italy, as I mentioned. According to tradition, a monk experienced doubt. I mentioned that earlier, that this seems to be some sort of a theme in some of these Eucharistic miracles, that those who experience them are in a phase of doubt or a phase of turmoil. So this monk, by his own admission, was doubting the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And in this particular case, there's a pretty dramatic result. The relics from Lanciano, by the way, continued to be preserved there, symbolizing kind of this ongoing devotion that we've had through the centuries. The fact that this very old Eucharistic miracle is still preserved in Lanciano and still draws thousands and thousands of pilgrims every year. Similarly, there's another one. It's not documented here, but he does have it on his website. The miracle of Bolsena in the 13th century, happened in 1263. Is a very similar one. It's a very prominent event, again associated with doubt. There was a priest who had harbored some doubts, apparently, and he began experiencing bleeding from a consecrated host while he was at the altar during the Mass. That dropped onto the corporal on the altar. Okay? That corporal is preserved to this day. This occurrence is actually depicted in a very famous fresco by Raphael that's in the Vatican, this particular Eucharistic miracle, because it not only reaffirmed the belief of that priest in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but it contributed to the establishment of the Feast of Corpus Christi. The year was 1263, remember? The year was 1263. Although Pope Urban VI makes no mention of it. If you go to look at the bull that created the feast in 1264, the following year, Okay? He doesn't make any mention of this specific Eucharistic miracle, but there is a strong tradition in our church that links the miracle at Bolsena to the establishment of this feast because St. Thomas Aquinas also mentions it. So there is, it's not actually, at Bolsena, I should mention, has not been scientifically studied. Lanciano has. It's one of the ones we're going to talk about. Bolsena has not been, but many such miracles have been. And I want to share some of that with you this morning, okay? I want to share some of what we know forensically, scientifically about some of these. How many of you were here when Father Robert Spitzer, the Jesuit, was here from California? Okay. So Father Spitzer has done a lot of research on these as well. Blessed Carlo, of course, his knowledge only went so far. Father Spitzer, who is in a category all his own, right? I can hang with him for about 5 minutes, and then, the eyes start to glass over. But in a good way, I mean that. But he's brings to the Eucharist this understanding that is scientific. So I want to qualify what I'm getting ready to tell you by pointing out to you that I am not that kind of doctor, okay? The disclaimer that I am not a forensic scientist, I am not a pathologist, I have not studied medicine, but I am a doctor of philosophy. And so what does that mean? Nothing. What it means is that I do sometimes occasionally get this whiff of profundity, like the profound when you encounter it, okay? Have y'all seen those memes that circulate on social media sometimes about somebody on the plane looking for a doctor? Y'all seen this? We need a doctor. Well, I'm a doctor of philosophy. Well, if the patient's going to die, well, we're all going to die. That's what I bring, okay? That's what I'm talking about that I bring. Because these events often do have a profound impact, and I use that word specifically, a profound impact on the faith of believers. It strengthens our conviction in the mystical. I mean, that's my experience studying these, is that it does seem to always happen in a period in the church where there's either an individual, and then, of course, nothing is ever private revelation, is it? No. It doesn't just affect the individual, it then spreads over into the entire church. And it happens at times where there is this doubt or turmoil or a need to really build up our faith. So there is a profound impact there that strengthens our conviction, I think. Pilgrimages to these associated sites are very common, obviously reflecting the desire of people to have that encounter, to sort of understand that a little more. So my qualifier here was that I don't bring that level of expertise, but I can share with you what I know from having studied them historically, and the forensic information that is pretty accessible to most of us in probably a very simple way, okay? Are there skepticism about these miracles? Let's go ahead and deal with that up front. Skepticism in the world? Sure. Some argue, and I've seen this, I've read this, some people argue that scientific scrutiny can explain these phenomena through other natural means, processes. There are some critics that maintain that some of these miracles, for instance, can be explained by bacteria. One in particular, and I do not recall which one, that's not one Blessed Carlo did, one in particular that is appears to be a bleeding host, but it's really not blood, not human blood. It's probably explainable by bacteria, for instance, that there's a red bacteria that infiltrated this particular host. But let's dig a little deeper here, because I think that before we are quick to dismiss all of these as such, and I don't think anybody in this room is quick to dismiss these, but because we have science, good science, and it actually answers questions that we didn't even know we had until we got the answer, and then we thought, oh, that's a great question, right? Let's look at some that have been forensically studied, okay? 4 in particular. We're going to look at each one of these a little bit in detail on their own. These were selected because they are the ones that have been the most scientifically studied and the most well documented. Lanciano, we don't have a great chain of custody for, making it a little bit problematic, but we still have some fascinating forensics that come out of the study of that. Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Tixla, Mexico, and Sokolka, Poland. And Sokolka, Poland is 3 panels, actually. It's back there on the back table. Buenos Aires is probably one of the best studied, and there's also 3 panels on it in the very back there. The scientific testing of the Lanciano host, for instance. This actually has been studied twice in recent history, 1971 at first and then 1981, so a decade apart. The scientist was Dr. Eduardo Lanoli, as you see his name there. It is the first Eucharistic host purported to be a Eucharistic miracle that's ever been forensically studied. It was the very first to be subjected to scientific testing, and again, with the full permission and blessing of the church to do this. Again, I think this is a great opportunity for us to remind ourselves that there is a beautiful intersection of faith and science that is always at work. We don't see these things as contradictory. We don't see these things as impeding one another. We actually see them in complete harmony. And so the church was absolutely, once we had the technology to know, the church was 100% behind the study of these miracles, the ones that could be studied. So Lanciano, again, as I said, its purported origin is the 8th century in Lanciano, Italy. We do not have a good chain of custody, and that's a problem. From the perspective of science, that's a problem, to not have that. So we have the problem of the unverified chain of custody. The age of the host is obviously a challenge. We're talking about something that is centuries and centuries old. But the notable features about the Lanciano host is that there appeared to be a tissue that was growing out of the host. As in other Eucharistic miracles, you can look at it and you can see that something has changed, visibly changed about the host. And in this case, there is tissue, what appears to be tissue growing out of the center of it. Well, if you take a very tiny, tiny, tiny little microscopic sample of that tissue, which is all a scientist needs, certainly now, these days, to do any kind of histopathological examination of it, what becomes apparent and what has been verified is that the tissue has a muscular structure to it. And this was first published in 1971, that it was human tissue. And then in 1981, we knew that it was a striated muscular tissue like only found in heart muscle. Okay, now hold on to that thought, because remember, this is 1971, 1981, the first to be studied, and it is type AB blood. Okay, so it is human tissue, and it is type AB blood. Again, the first to be studied, others would follow. So this sort of served, as many ways, as kind of a foundation, as a starting point then to begin to understand or compare other Eucharistic miracles that could be compared to the study of Lanciano. The scientific test of Buenos Aires, which happened in 1996, was overseen by none other than Cardinal Bergoglio, who was the Archbishop there. Cardinal Bergoglio, who is Pope Francis, was overseen directly by him while he was there as Archbishop, and Dr. Ricardo Gomez, who was actually the chief pathologist who worked on this. Dr. Frederick Zugabe was called in as well. Now, let me point out that when this investigation was done, and as Cardinal there, or Cardinal Archbishop Bergoglio, Pope Francis wanted this investigated in a way, and remember he's a Jesuit, so he considers himself to be a scientist. So he wanted this done in a scientific sort of double-blind way where the pathologists who were involved did not know where the sample came from, what they were receiving. Okay? In no way did he want to bias the outcome of this. So this has a really interesting story. So the context of this is that a host was discarded in Buenos Aires, a church, Santa Maria in Buenos Aires. And it was because someone dropped it. Someone dropped a host, and the sacristan, of course, picked it up and put it in water in the sacristy, put it up on a shelf to dissolve. Okay? And as the story goes, and this actually has a very good validated chain of custody, because the sacristan reported it to the pastor. The pastor documented it, actually documented after, of course, they realized what had happened to the host. So this is very, very well documented in the record. When they went to retrieve the host in the water that should have dissolved, what was noted immediately is that there was tissue, bleeding tissue that was growing out of it. Okay? As you can see there. It's a photograph. That is the Buenos Aires host, by the way. So the host was photographed. Actually, it was Archbishop Bergoglio who intervened immediately when he heard about it and asked that it be documented, photographed. Then something very interesting happened. And I know that some of us in the church won't have a hard time understanding this. The host remained in the cabinet for 3 years. Okay, so some of us are nodding and laughing because we understand that. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to deal with this, right? Save that, put that up there. It's been photographed, it's been documented. Well, 3 years went by. 3 years went by. And in many ways, that's good. Because when it sort of resurfaces on everyone's radar 3 years later, Dr. Gomez noted that there had been absolutely no change or decomposition in this is afterwards, there's been no change or decomposition in the tissue, but that in fact it continued to actively bleed. Okay? After 3 years. So some of the notable characteristics of this are that there is no decomposition of the tissue or the blood. Dr. Frederick Zugabe, who is a noted New York pathologist, was a noted New York pathologist. I think is Dr. Zugabe still alive? I don't know. He actually has done quite a bit of work on the shroud, is how I know the name. But the tissue is from the heart. It's heart tissue. And to be very specific, I can tell you even more specifically than that, he identified it as tissue from the upper left ventricle of the heart. He documented that there were, inexplicably, as he put in his report, inexplicably, there are living white blood cells, living white blood cells in the tissue. And this led him to conclude, and basically, this is where I think he realized he was dealing with something other than an ordinary investigation, because he wanted to know who would take tissue from someone who was living to be inspected. Why would you take human heart tissue from a living person and give it to me to examine? Not knowing what he was working on, that he was working with a Eucharistic miracle. Now, this is where I'm wading into areas that I don't really understand, but I'll share with you what I've read. That there are white blood cells that are actually, that are living, that are embedded in the ventricle wall, which Dr. Zugabe noted indicates physical torture of some kind. Okay? Around the chest area. The blood is human. It is type AB. Okay, so can we review? Type AB, human heart tissue. Type AB, human heart tissue. The difference in the Buenos Aires host is that it is actively bleeding. It continues to bleed. Yes? We don't have an RH factor, which I'm going to touch upon. Yeah, we don't know if it's AB positive or AB negative. Okay, so then there's one from Tixla, Mexico that was investigated, happened in 2006. Again, this investigation took place under the direction of the bishop there and actually has received the blessing of the bishop and the church. The chief scientist on this one, again, was not just one person. In this case, in Tixla, Mexico, they called in 10 Let's just be sure we cover all the bases. Call in 10 different scientists, forensic experts, pathologists, again, not knowing what they were testing, not knowing what they were looking at. We're given this sample. But let's talk about the context first. This one happened in 2006. A religious sister who had actually gone to the tabernacle and taken a host out that she was going to go and put in a pyx. She was going to go distribute it to a sick person who couldn't get to Mass that day. And when she opened the pyx, she noticed that the host was exuding blood, or what appeared to be blood. There was something red coming out of the host. So she showed it to 2 priests who immediately called the bishop in this case, immediately secured and verified the chain of custody of this particular host. And it was so obviously transformed that the bishop called in 10 experts right away. I mean, 1 in the beginning, but then I think the one, Dr. Gomez, said, no, let's get more people involved, right? So there were 10 experts actually who were called in. They didn't wait 3 years this time. They didn't wait 3 years. But there was a team that came together of scientific experts who looked at this, included university scientists, it included physicians, pathologists, it included a forensic expert, a criminal forensic expert, and even an animal pathologist was called in on this. 2 experts in DNA, biotechnology, were called in on this particular one. So this one is perhaps, next to Buenos Aires, one of the better studied of these. So one of the things I think we can say about this one, and everybody would agree, I know this is a point that Father Spitzer made when he was here, is that this one, the chain of custody is so good, and every box was checked as far as the transfer, the documentation, the photographing of it, the panel of experts that was employed to do this. The thoroughness of the testing is excellent, it's outstanding. So we have this unquestioned chain of custody, very brief, different analytical and pathological tests, 13 of them in total were done on this host, and we find the same thing. We find living white blood cells, fresh bleeding, and it is type AB blood. It is type AB. Type AB. Type AB. Type AB. Are we catching a theme? Is there a theme? Human heart tissue, living, bleeding, alive, right? And type AB. Then this last one I want to talk about is Sokółka, Poland, which happened in 2008. It's still pending ecclesiastical approval, by the way. I do want to say that. This one is. Although the church authorized the investigation of it, it is not yet fully approved as a Eucharistic miracle. But I suspect soon will be. The chief scientist involved, there were actually 3 of them here. The context of this one is that in 2008, this is interesting to me, it was October 12th, 2008, and I don't know why this jumped out at me, but this is 2 years after the death of Blessed Carlo. He died on October 12th, 2006. This miracle happened on October 12th, 2008, so maybe that's a coincidence. But Sokółka, Poland, the host was dropped. Again, it's one of those things where you're distributing Holy Communion and somebody just dropped a host. And so it was picked up and again, given to the sacristan. The priest actually picked it up, gave it to the sacristan to place in the sacristy in water to dissolve it. And a week later, the priest didn't think about it, but a week later, the sacristan went in and thought, oh, we put that host in water, and opened the cabinet and saw that not only had the host not dissolved, but there was this red crescent shape, almost that you can see there, growing out of it. So again, it's a very similar situation as with these other 3, is that the priest, of course, notified the bishop. That's what you're supposed to do. If you have a bleeding host, right? If you have a host that's bleeding, is that what you're going to do? Your first phone call is going to be to the bishop. So it notified the bishop, and it was Archbishop who asked that the host be removed from the water and to be put onto a corporal, and I'm not sure why all of this, but this is what he asked, be placed onto a corporal and put back into the tabernacle to be observed, to see, I guess, what was going to happen. And after some period of time, several months, the host had not changed in any way or degenerated in any way. So that's when the Archbishop said, let's proceed with the scientific testing. The medical school at the University of Białystok in Poland oversaw all of this. 2 physicians were put in charge of independent examinations. They did not compare their results until after they had finished their testing. Two different fields, one of them forensics, one of them pathology. The chain of custody was very controlled, but again, we have the problem of a little bit of a gap in time, that the host remained in the tabernacle for a while, which would be one flaw in the process. Okay, unlike Tixla, which was immediately documented and verified. It is living heart tissue. There's no surprise there, I guess. And it is type AB blood. Okay. So, interestingly, what came out of the report of Solkolka, and I think this is, you can read more about it on the panel back there, is that the forensic examination of the tissue indicated to the forensic expert that it was living tissue, but it was in the process of dying. Now, that was an interesting note in this particular report, as indicated by the segmentation and fragmentation of the cells, which I do not understand. But the forensic expert said that, that it was living, but in a state of dying. Okay, so the reason I pointed out the blood type is because this is the same blood type that appears on the Shroud of Turin. It is the same blood type that's on the Sudarium of Oviedo, which many people believe was the cloth that covered the face of Jesus that's mentioned in John's Gospel. That's held in Oviedo, Spain. It's been there since the 7th century. It is a forensic match. They're the same blood. They're all the same blood type. Now, this becomes statistically important when you realize that, that type AB blood is less than 5% of the population. And if you have type AB negative blood, you're less than 1% of the population. So we don't know the RH factor on any of these, which is kind of interesting. They can't get an RH factor. So even as sophisticated as our forensics have evolved, you've got this kind of scientifically now inexplicable link between all of these Eucharistic miracles and a cloth that millions believe covered the body of Jesus and therefore bears his blood, and the Sudarium in Oviedo, Spain, that many people believe, we have a good chain of custody on that too, by the way. Many people believe that this was the cloth that covered Jesus' face. We know it's a forensic match for the shroud. I mean, it lines up. You can put them together and it lines up. There's 200 points of congruity in the blood spatter and blood stain on those cloths. So, do you understand the statistical implications of this? That if this is such a rare blood type, isn't it rather unlikely that you would have these isolated different incidents and objects that all bear the same blood type? Don't you think that's interesting? Statistically implausible. Okay? I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's implausible that they would be connected. All of them have the absence of notable decomposition. In other words, you can't see any decomposition in any of these hosts, including the one of Lanciano that's, 1,200 years old now, 1,300 years old. They are all living human blood tissue, muscle tissue, all type AB blood. White blood cells are present and active. Living heart tissue that has been traumatized. We know that coming out of the Solkolka study. So it's interesting that if you have, as in the case of Tixla, there is continually, and Buenos Aires, there's a continuous production of new blood from the center of the host. That blood is being pushed from the center of the host to the exterior of the host. In the case of Tixla, that's active. That's going on now. Okay? Then we have an interesting scientific challenge in what some would say is a DNA problem. So if you have a host that is actively bleeding human blood, would you not think that with our technology we could take a sample of that blood and get a DNA profile to get an entire helix, a human genome? Because you know what? If you slice me open and take my blood, you can do that. You can do that. And you don't need very much. Well, guess what? These bleeding hosts that have been verified to be human blood with living white blood cells, when attempts are made to amplify those samples, and you have to take a small sample and amplify it, as they say, to amplify them to obtain a profile through DNA testing, no DNA profile can be identified. The helix that you would normally get for a human being, on the whole, you know what I'm talking about, it's very beautiful, by the way, that you would get for a complete DNA profile of a human being is incomplete on all of these. The Buenos Aires host, this has been tried on, and the Tixla host, this has been tried on. The Tixla host was subjected to genetic testing only a short time after Dr. Gomez was called in on that one. And so if it is actively bleeding, this makes no sense. Now, the reason I say that's statistically interesting to us is that it's only these 4 blood samples we can't seem to get a helix on. I could ask every single person in this room to bleed, right? And every single one of us would produce some sort of genetic profile. The same is true, however, of the sudarium that's held in Oviedo, the blood samples that have been taken from it, and the blood samples that have been taken from the shroud. We cannot get a complete genome. And we cannot get even an Rh factor. So, and this is what some skeptics would say, okay? So I'm going to answer that too. Does all old blood test AB? I've read this. Actually, there is someone that I have worked with on another project, Dr. Kelly Kearse is his name, who's far more qualified in this field than I am, because he is a hematologist. And his argument is that he thinks that all old blood would test AB. Except that that's not true. I mean, except that we know there are other old blood samples that have tested as other blood types. So, but that's from a skeptic's perspective, and Dr. Kearse is very, very scholarly, but he is a skeptic. Some skeptics would say that bacteria can account for the redness, I mentioned that. But for testing as actual human heart tissue, how do you explain that? How do you explain that? We do not know a perfect chain of custody for all these Eucharistic miracles, and that's one of the things that Blessed Carlo documented. But those which have been studied have yielded quite a lot of information about that. So when we, again, sort of leave us with this idea that, something that I've talked about in here before, when we are confronted with a mystery like this, and it is mystery, even though we know as much information as we do, we still, what have we done? We've hit a wall, right? Our scientific testing has taken us only so far. We can tell you the blood type, we can tell you it's human tissue, we can tell you it's actively producing white blood cells, but oh, by the way, we can't tell you who this person was because we can't get a genetic profile. So it's like we hit this wall of understanding, just like we do with many things in our faith, that we are limited, again, to go back to something, to reference something that St. Thomas Aquinas said about apprehending things with our senses, that there are just some things we cannot apprehend with our senses. And is that by design, that we're not supposed to? Divine design, we're not supposed to. So whenever we confront mystery, you've heard me say this before, what am I going to say? We are already in the presence of something greater than ourselves. Just by acknowledging that there is something that's limited, our knowledge is limited. When we confront the limits of our human capacity to know something, and we have to acknowledge that human capacity has a limit. Do you understand? I need to see some heads nodding. Thank you. I get my one validation for the day right there. When we confront that, we are already in the presence of something greater than we are. And is that enough? Is that enough to simply acknowledge that? So, in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that Eucharistic miracles still stand as a profound, use that word again, powerful manifestation of faith, encapsulating the mysterious nature of the Eucharist that we've always believed, the Church has always professed from the very beginning, but making it available to us in a physical, tangible way that can be apprehended by our senses. Whether you view these through the lens of like scientific scrutiny or religious conviction, whether you don't need all that science, you see a bleeding host and you go, yep, that's Jesus. You know? But do you understand what a beautiful harmony this is? That it's okay to be a Thomas. Do y'all know this? It's okay to be a Thomas. It's okay to say, show me. Show me the blood. Tell me about it. Now, what kind of tissue is that? That's okay. Some people need to know that way. Some people would look at it as I say, just say, okay, yes, bleeding, that's Jesus. But this is a beautiful harmony because in the study of these, we have both. We have both. We become aware, whichever way you approach these, we become aware of a profound connection between the material and the divine, right? The material substance we are looking at and the divine explanation for what we cannot know fully. So we're right there with both of those ways of knowing. Or as another way to say it in our Catholic faith might be where heaven and earth meet. Right here in these Eucharistic miracles. Okay, how am I doing? I'm done. Look at that, I finished. All right. So, I really encourage you, and I did finish a few minutes early, but I really encourage you to take a look at some of the panels from Blessed Carlo's website. To have the opportunity to learn more about him. I actually have some prayer cards of his that were coming. They did not arrive in time, but I hopefully will have them for you next week. He's really, really an interesting, fascinating young man. He is buried in the, actually he's not buried, he's entombed in a church in Assisi, Italy, and his body is incorrupt. His body's incorrupt, so. All right, so I really encourage you to take an opportunity to please look at these and consider this. Yes, don't ask me any scientific questions. Only ones I know the answer to. Yes. Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Right, a complete genome. Yeah, I do understand that. Well, I don't know about the Eucharistic miracles. No, I don't think so. I don't think they even get like enough to understand anything about the person. No. In the case of, for instance, the shroud, we get a partial. Just not a complete, but a partial.
Is that enough to do a partial?
I don't know, honestly, that the church has authorized any further comparative testing at this point. I don't be surprised if that happens. There are some things going on, I can tell you right now. I can't really tell you specifically what they are, but there are some things going on in the study of the shroud, for instance. Now that the Pope owns it, you know, it was owned by a private family until 1983. But now that the Pope owns it, this particular Pope has been a little more open to the idea of scientific testing than others before him. And I can tell you there's some things underway that are going to potentially answer some huge questions, one of which has already been answered, and I can't tell you. But I will be able to tell you soon, okay? I will be able to tell you soon. And it's only because I signed like a non-disclosure agreement. Like I'm not supposed to talk about it, and I can't believe this is being recorded, and I said something about it. So anyway, yes, question.
Was stereotyping done for the for it? I mean, to know if it's human, you said it's human heart.
Human heart tissue.
Chromosome, is it human chromosome? I mean, 23XY or 23XX to know if it's a male or female. I mean, what makes them think it's human heart tissue?
Pathologically, you can look at tissue, and I'm going to look at a medical doctor in here. Dr. Kuchera, how do we know it's human heart tissue?
I presume because over the years people have studied the pathology of the heart, and it has unique characteristics that you can compare with other people. So that's how they know. They say human heart muscle has some special striations,
That's it. That's the word.
and that tells you it's a heart muscle.
But heart muscle of a human is likely the same of animals, like striated. I mean, all of them are striated. I mean, what
Right.
makes it human?
I'm not a forensic scientist. I can't answer that question. But it would be the same thing. I would assume the same knowledge that would be employed if you find any sort of tissue or remain, a human or a remain of any kind of an animal, that a forensic scientist would be able to determine if that is human or if it is of a specific animal species. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know if there's a book that we can buy if we want to, like,
Yes.
really think about these?
Yes, there is. There's actually one that just came out that Father Robert Spitzer published. It's called Science at the Doorstep of the Eucharist. And it's pretty dense reading, but it should answer every question you could possibly have. Yes, Deacon.
I just have a thought. This is more philosophical, I guess you could say. You know, God created us out of love. He wants us to love Him back. He gives us free will. He said, because we can't, if we demand love from someone or we create that love, it's not free will.
That's right.